Hi everyone, my name is Izzy DiMaria, and today I will be discussing the article Gender Capital in Male Bodybuilders by Tristan S. Bridges. So, this article explores the concept of gender capital and how it relates to the cultural capital and hegemonic masculinity that men use to gain status in different contexts. Bridges uses Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital to develop the concept of gender capital, which refers to the traits people use to present themselves in a gendered manner and gain status in different social contexts. According to Bridges, capital refers to the value afforded contextually relevant presentations of gendered selves, and it is interactionally defined and negotiated. This means that the way resources are perceived and used in social practice determines the value of capital. Therefore, cultural capital essentially only matters in social contexts and is applied in different ways depending on those contexts. What's interesting is how gender capital in men differs through history and culture. For example, Bridges explained how long hair used to be a sign of nobility among men, and long hair is also considered masculine in contemporary rock. However, politicians may not be able to express the same kind of masculinity with long hair. Bridges argues that gender capital builds on the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which is a set of social norms that men use to reinforce the dominance of men over women and other men. He explains that hegemonic masculinity is established to recognize status asymmetricies in inter and intragender relations. And it's basically used to define how men can be more or less masculine and in turn dominate women and other men. The article has two main arguments. Firstly, Bridges explores how gender capital builds on cultural capital and hegemonic masculinity. He argues that cultural capital refers to specific repertoires of knowledge, tastes, dispositions, and objects of desire that individuals within particular social spaces perceive and employ for status accumulation. In other words, cultural capital is a set of attributes that people use to gain status in a specific social context. This builds into Bourdieu's definition of capital as energy that only exists and produces its effects in the field in which it is produced and reproduced. Each other's property attached to class is given its value and efficacy by the specific laws of each field. This basically means that the value of cultural capital is determined by the specific social context in which they are used. Second, Bridges examines the value of gender capital in relationships between bodybuilders and other males. To support his argument, Bridges analyzed interviews with 43 amateur and professional bodybuilders at 4 hardcore bodybuilding gyms and observed the practices of the sport. He found that bodybuilders have high status in the gym, but differ in masculinity outside the gym. Bridges goes on to explain a reoccurring theme among the bodybuilding world and their development of the masculine self, and that is insecurity. For example, grunts and groans may not only be a sign of a strong man working out, but also a plea for attention and recognition. This insecurity can be soothed by other things in different parts of society. Some men, for example, may use sports cars, money, or their occupation to feel less insecure. This evidence suggests that gender capital is a context-specific resource that is used differently in different social contexts. These differences in value based on social context are shown in a piece of his study where he's walking out of an action movie where strong men are particularly the star, and 2 men walking down the street laughed at the bodybuilders participating in the study for their abnormally strong bodies. He was challenged and made fun of outside of the gym for his physique. However, in the gym, it was a different story. Bodybuilders often tease others who are less strong. However, outside, this value of masculinity didn't transfer. Through observations like this, Bridges found that while the bodybuilder Drew is confident inside the gym, he's perceived differently outside the gym, leading him to have less confidence in his gender capital in different settings. This is a difference that men in the community are aware of and have to deal with in their daily lives. One bodybuilder named Chris told Bridges in an interview, "I can't use my street credit anywhere else. This is the only place it works. We're freaks to lots of people, but here we're like gods." There's even discrepancies between bodybuilders and powerlifters. For example, a powerlifter that Bridges interviewed stated that bodybuilders are gay because they are constantly touching and checking each other's bodies and obsessed with looks. The powerlifter claimed that they also engage in feminine behaviors like shaving their legs and wearing thongs. However, in a different context, many bodybuilders were also bouncers at nightclubs, where the gender capital of bodybuilding has value as well, but in a different way. Bodybuilders have high status in the gym due to their work ethic, strength, and appearance, but as a bouncer in a nightclub setting, people are afraid of bodies that serve as symbols of violence. So at first, gender capital wasn't something I fully understood or thought about in depth. I thought it was interesting how oftentimes men use gender capital not only to feel confident and dominate women, but also other men. I also found it interesting how gender capital value differs based on different contexts. For example, rock stars sporting long hair, men with sports cars, and other forms of capital making fun of bodybuilders for their capital. Even powerlifters calling bodybuilders gay for being into their looks. So overall, it just feels like no matter what social context you apply gender capital to, you can't really win no matter what, because men in another category will define you as gay or a boy instead of a man. So to me, what it looks like is that men are overall striving to dominate others in the form of gender capital while also dealing with the criticism of different manly men. I also found it interesting how Bridges relates that use of gender capital to insecurity. The article helped show that gender isn't really a fixed or innate characteristic, but rather a social construct that is produced and reproduced in specific social contexts. Gender capital even creates status hierarchies among men. These findings highlight the diversity and complexity of masculinities. The article was very thought-provoking in terms of raising questions about the relationship between gender, power, and the body. It also made me think about other contexts in which people use their bodies to gain gender capital, such as beauty pageants or professional sports. I think that women also can use gender capital in varying contexts. For example, like I said before, pageants, gender capital for women might also involve their physical appearance, clothing, social skills, communication style, education, and occupation. For example, in the workplace, women may utilize gender capital by conforming to gendered expectations of appearance and communication, such as wearing makeup, dressing in a certain way, and using language and tone that's perceived as more feminine. In other contexts, such as social events, women may use gender capital by conforming to gender expectations of femininity, like wearing fashionable clothes, being sociable, submissive, and polite. Women also might utilize gender capital by displaying knowledge of popular culture or fashion, which can be considered feminine. However, it's important to realize that the extent to which men and women utilize gender capital varies depending on factors such as race, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation. These differences aren't really discussed in the article, but people who belong to marginalized groups may find it more difficult to access gender capital due to the systematic barriers and discrimination. Also, the pressure to conform to gender expectations can be oppressive and limiting and can perpetuate harmful gender stereotypes. While he didn't go into too much detail, Bridges mentioned male powerlifters who openly identified as homosexual. When the powerlifter was calling the bodybuilders gay, he said that he wasn't referring to those two specifically. In fact, they were no different from their heterosexual counterparts in the gym. This leads to another point that we've made before in class, how sometimes the word gay can be utilized to simply insult and emasculate men in different contexts rather than only referring to homosexuality. Therefore, I think it's important to challenge and expand our understanding of gender roles and expectations in order to create a more inclusive and equitable spaces for all people. I think that it's important to broaden the definition of masculinity to be more inclusive and less rigid. And it's also important to create spaces and communities that are more accepting of diverse gender expressions and don't rely on the display of hyper masculinity as a means of gaining social status.